Welcome to the Theological Family Ministry Podcast, a podcast for parents as well as children and youth ministry leaders. We are dedicated to showing how theological study and biblical application relate to the discipleship of children and youth. As always, we're hosted by Pastor Ben Palaz, the pastor of family and children's discipleship at Curtis Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia, and Tony Trusoni, the family and student pastor at Faith Family Church in Finksburg, Maryland.
Good afternoon, Ben. How you doing today?
Doing pretty well. A little bit rested after a long weekend with Labor Day. How about you?
Doing well. So what did you do on Labor Day this year?
Let's see. I did some stuff around the house. I can't even remember. Cut the grass, and then we had a birthday party to go to. So, just kind of took it easy. How about you? You cook some bacon or something?
We did have steak. We didn't have bacon on yesterday, but we did indeed have steak. So that was delicious as always. So, and we had some fun with some family. So that was nice. But, it's a little weird how, this tradition of being off for Labor Day, it makes a little more sense when you understand the labor movement in America. But it's just an odd way. I mean, a lot of people don't even understand Labor Day. Would you agree with that?
Probably so, yeah. I mean, I honestly don't know a little bit about the history of it, but you're usually more adept into the history of things anyway, so.
We won't go too into it because that's a little controversial sometimes in Christian circles, the Labor Day and the labor movement history. But, it does bring up the important topic of labor. And Labor Day is one of the few holidays that we haven't done a podcast about. But we're not really doing a podcast about Labor Day, but we're just kind of using that as a springboard today. But I think a helpful springboard on the topic of labor. Do you think that Christians talk much about labor and about work?
I don't hear a ton. I mean, you see some, but it is something worth pursuing because we spend a lot of our lives working, and that may not just be in employment, but God is a God who works, and He's made us in His image. So it is something that we should pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, both of us, our work is mainly as a pastor. That's our vocation. And I want to ask, how did you end up as a pastor? How did you end up in the vocation that you're in?
Well, I do want to note that I'm also a televangelist. I want to start introducing myself that way, just to see what kind of reaction it gets, because our church is televised, and so I've shared the gospel on television. But I didn't do it with fancy cufflinks, and for those who know me, I don't really have the cool televangelist hair. But anyway, I ended up a pastor. I was about 16 years old, and I started getting a sense that the Lord might be calling me into ministry. Before I got that sense, my mom said something to me, just suggesting, hey, maybe this would be something that the Lord's doing. My pastor said something to me, and I didn't think they were foolish. I just didn't really see it. And anyway, with time, I began to get that impression, and then the church that I was in affirmed that. I had opportunity to minister and got more training. The churches I was involved in continued to affirm that gift, and so anyway, I guess that's the short of it. But it was a sense of internal calling as well as other people coming and speaking into my life and affirming that God's direction there. So,
yeah,
how about you?
That's awesome. So, I think there's some similarities there. I will bring up an internal calling I felt as well, but I will say, I think as we talked about in the previous podcast, I think we read too much into those kind of senses of internal calling, and that's never even a biblical idea of how you pursue a vocation whatsoever, including pastorate. But when I was in high school, about not too terribly long after I was led to the Lord, maybe a year and a half, I remember I went on a missions trip where I was asked to share the gospel, and I didn't know what that meant when I was told to share my testimony, rather. And there would be a translator, and I didn't really know what that word meant, so I just kind of did what I saw people doing on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings in my church. I took a text of the Bible and I related it to our lives, I kind of brought in my story a little bit, but it definitely wasn't a testimony. It was more sermonette, not what I was asked to do, but I was affirmed by some leaders in the church that maybe God might be directing me to be a pastor, and kind of exposit the word and relate it to life in different areas, different age groups, maybe even through that time. And I think God was really directing me, and I felt him pulling me to ministry. And that as well was affirmed along the way, especially in my church and seminary, where the pastor really took time to really shepherd me and work with me, and really saw God fanning to flame the gifts that go along with the qualifications for pastoral ministry. So that's how I ended up in my vocation, so somewhat similar.
Yeah, cool.
And how have most people found their vocation throughout history? Has it been this kind of way that we described?
No, most of them did what their parents did, their mom or their dad. And there's, if it was the family business or they were farmers, the parents trained them with time. Maybe parents would send a child to apprentice with some other tradesman, this kind of thing. But often, the parents were very vocal and involved in the process. There wasn't like, well, Johnny, what do you want to be when you grow up? Okay, you didn't have the choice of, you can be whatever you want to be, shoot for the moon. You just did what your parents did to make a living, to stay alive, literally.
Absolutely. So, yeah, that's been the main way throughout history. And even beyond times, the vast majority of people did what their daddy did, or their mom did. But even cases where people didn't, cases where people kind of broke away from it, it was people have done for vocations throughout most of history what was needed, not what they necessarily wanted to do. Where there was an area of need in society, where there was a spot to be filled, what was expected and thrown upon them, rather than, following their dreams in that kind of inherent way.
Yes, it's a good way of putting it. It was not that we have the luxury in some ways of doing that now, but even then, there's a lot of necessary things that need to be done, and so the whole following your dreams is it can be a little narcissistic, and
it can be.
But we don't have to go down that rabbit
trail.
Now
we've looked at what people have done in the past. Should we go back to the old-time religion? Should parents determine their kids' vocational future just like they did in the past?
I don't think so. I think they should give input, but I don't know that they should. I don't think they should determine it for their child. You could just think of a lot of scenarios where that may go wrong, and plus the culture that we're in, at least in the West, you can see that being a recipe for existential disaster.
Yeah, it's funny because I definitely agree with you that we shouldn't expect that. And I think there are cases where it could be good. But, my dad comes from a line of home builders. His dad was a home builder. His dad's dad was a home builder, and so on. And I'm not a home builder, and I would be a lousy home builder. It would not be a good fit for me. So I'm glad that my dad doesn't determine what I do, although I appreciate very much what he has done. And there's nowhere in the Bible that says, you need to do what your dad does, or you need to not do what your dad does, or mom does. So now, do you think that parents and churches have backed off too much from involvement in future vocation?
I think some have, and there has been the just follow your dreams, follow your heart. You can be whatever you want to be. Others have, I think maybe they step in too much, and they know the plans that they have for their child, says the parent, and project that onto them pretty strongly. And a friend of mine actually he was a tennis coach and a teacher at some school, I think up in New England. Maybe it was somewhere in the South, but he had lived in New England, and there was the dad of this player, the tennis player that he had had some serious issues, and he had apparently applied to an Ivy League school and been turned down. So he told his daughter was a top flight student as well as a top flight tennis player, and he wanted her to apply to this Ivy League school, get accepted, and then turn them down just to show them. And there were a lot of other ways where he was stepping into her life, trying to control it, and it just was really not a good situation. And so I don't know that this man was a Christian, but I've heard of other kind of circumstances like that. And so I think you can have kind of both extremes.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. So I think more often we can be overly focused on autonomy, And I think the reality is it's becoming more and more rare for children following their parents' footsteps, or for even parents to have any role whatsoever, or churches to have any role whatsoever in helping shepherd them into future vocations. And I think that's a shame, and I think it's perhaps an overreaction to what was also a problem in the past. But I agree with you that there are definitely examples where people use their children as little tools, as little chess pieces for their own agenda. But looking at work, what is vocation, and how is it different from career?
As now, this may be we're getting into some areas of disagreement or just my lack of knowledge. But vocation, when I think about it, has the connotations of calling, with a sense of there's the implication that you're called by God into this sphere of life. And it may not be a paid kind of thing where you're clocking in and out or getting a check for this, whereas career carries the idea of profession and payment. And so I have a career as a doctor. So that's how I would distinguish the two. But what are you thinking along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, definitively, to link it to calling. Vocation, it's a term often applied to, in a flow chart, applied to careers, but it comes from Latin, from the idea of calling, but I think this idea of calling that it comes from doesn't entail that kind of like mystical calling, but rather kind of the calling that God has placed upon you through your circumstances. That's when I understand it. But, the area in which you really give yourself over and commit yourself specifically as your lot in life and how you serve God in that kind of sense. So I think vocation is typically going to be your day job. For the vast majority of people, vocation is, working as a pastor or a plumber or whatever. But it can be being other things. Have a career means you're getting paid. Your vocation can be being a student. That can be your calling based upon your situation in life that God has used and brought together. It can be being a mom. It can be being. I know of a friend who takes care of their mother who is of poor health, and that's kind of their vocation right now, and their area, their calling in life, to give their vast majority of their time to that.
Yeah, I like the way you described that.
Now, are vocations callings from God?
Possibly, but not in a strict technical sense always, I guess. But the way you described it in terms of the circumstances that you have and how God uses that to move you to a certain kind of action. Yeah, the term has been used to talk about vocations as calling from God, but I don't think it's correct to refer to them, like I got a message from the Lord that I'm called to XYZ vocation. Now, some people may have unique experiences and circumstances. The Lord is free to do as he pleases. And now, again, this is a unique situation, but like Paul, he was told he was to go to the Gentiles. I don't know that, or I'm confident we're not all to expect the same kind of experience of, the Lord blinding us with his glory and these kinds of things. But there's one where maybe it was an exception was made. Here's an example, like youth and children's ministry, music ministry, dance ministry, puppet ministry, whatever you want to hash it out and parse it up. From the Bible, you can't say, well, the Lord has called me to such and such. He may have gifted you uniquely to excel and to minister well in those particular areas. I don't know about a couple of those in that list, but anyway, that's just kind of my musings on that. But what are your thoughts?
No, that's good. I think that's a lot along the lines of my thoughts. So, I think in some sense it is a calling from God, clearly. I've interacted with some in one specific career, in addition to being pastor, that really stress that what they're doing is God's divine call on their life. And if they don't do that, they're like rebelling against God, and which really relates a lot to what we talked about God's revealing his will. And I don't think calling is that. And I think even for like the pastorate, typically, the main way that the pastorate is seen is the Bible talks about those who seek to be a pastor, those who seek the office of the pastor, seek a good thing. So I think God uses these things that